In the cold gray morning of May 19th, 1536, a woman knelt calmly on the scaffold at the Tower of London. Her name was Anne Boleyn, former Queen of England, mother of Elizabeth I, and the first queen ever to be publicly executed by her husband. Her rise to power was meteoric and her downfall was devastating. But why was she really executed? Was she guilty of the monstrous crimes she was accused of? Or was she simply too powerful, too ambitious, and too inconvenient? This is not just a story of love and betrayal. It is a chilling reminder of what happens when politics, power, and paranoia collide. This is the horror of Anne Boleyn's execution. Anne Boleyn didn't come from royalty, but she came from something nearly as valuable in the Tudor court: ambition and lineage. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a respected diplomat. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, was from one of England's most noble families. From an early age, Anne was sent to the Netherlands and then to France, where she gained an elite education and polished manners. These years would shape her into a formidable woman fluent in French, a lover of music and art, and intellectually curious. When she returned to England in the 1520s, Anne became a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. It wasn't long before King Henry VIII noticed her. But unlike her sister Mary, who had a brief affair with Anne refused to be just a mistress. She set her sights higher. Commentary: Anne's ambition has often been painted as manipulation. But let's be clear, she wasn't using Henry any more than he was using her. She played the only hand she had in a world where men controlled every piece of the game, and she played it brilliantly. Over the course of nearly 7 years, Anne and Henry engaged in a passionate courtship. But there was one obstacle: Henry was already married, and the Catholic Church would not grant him a divorce. What followed was a monumental rupture in European history. To marry Anne, Henry broke with the Pope, established the Church of England, and declared himself its head. In 1533, Anne and Henry were married in secret. Later that year, she was crowned queen, but the triumph was short-lived. Anne's pregnancy was cause for celebration. She and Henry were certain she would deliver the male heir he so desperately wanted. But on September 7, 1533, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry was disappointed but hopeful. Anne became pregnant again, but suffered a miscarriage, and then another. Each failure added fuel to a growing fire of resentment. Henry began to drift emotionally and physically away from Anne. Whispers at court turned into plots. Enemies like Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, began to act. Commentary: history has not been kind to women who failed to produce sons, even though we now know it's the father's genetics that determine the baby's sex. In Anne's time, her value as queen rested solely on her ability to give birth to a male heir. Her intelligence, charisma, and political savvy were irrelevant. Anne's political enemies saw her waning favor as an opportunity. She had made many foes during her reign. She was outspoken. She clashed with Cromwell over church revenue and the treatment of the poor. She also had no patience for sycophants. These traits, admirable today, made her dangerous then. In April 1536, Henry began courting Jane Seymour, demure, obedient, and everything Anne was not. Soon after, the walls began to close in on Anne. She was arrested and charged with adultery, incest, and treason. Among her alleged lovers were court musicians, nobles, and her own brother, George Boleyn. The accusations were absurd. One man was accused of sleeping with Anne on a day he was known to be in a different country. But in Tudor England, proof mattered little if the king wanted you gone. Commentary: this is a textbook example of a political takedown masked as justice. It's the equivalent of a modern show trial, a kangaroo court designed to justify what's already been decided behind closed doors. The arrest came fast. Mark Smeaton, a musician, was tortured into confessing. Others denied the charges but were still condemned. Anne, imprisoned in the Tower, was left to watch her allies fall one by one. She maintained her innocence to the end. Anne's trial began on May 15, 1536. She was brought before a jury of nobles, many of whom were enemies or politically indebted to Cromwell or Henry. She defended herself with courage and dignity. She pointed out inconsistencies in the charges, questioned the logic of the timeline, and appealed to reason. It didn't matter. She was found guilty. Commentary: imagine being tried in a court where every juror was either your enemy or afraid of the man who wanted you dead. That was Anne's reality. She didn't stand a chance. 5 men were executed for adultery with the queen, including her brother. Anne's own sentence was to be carried out by a swordsman specially brought in from France. It was considered a more noble death than the axe. It was Henry's last gift. On the morning of May 19th, Anne rose early. She dressed carefully in a crimson gown and asked for her ladies-in-waiting to pray with her. She reportedly said, "I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck." She laughed as she touched it. At around 8 a.m., Anne stepped onto the scaffold erected on Tower Green. She addressed the crowd. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die according to law. I die the king's faithful servant, but God's first." She knelt upright on the straw. The swordsman removed his shoes, crept behind her quietly, in one swift stroke. It was over in an instant. Her body was placed in an arrow chest. There had been no proper coffin. She was buried in an unmarked grave beneath the chapel. Commentary. Anne's death was not just a personal tragedy, it was a moral wound in the nation. The woman who helped change the course of religious history was buried like a common criminal. The silence after her beheading echoed louder than any scream. Anne's daughter Elizabeth was just 2.5 years old when her mother was executed. She was declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. But fate had other plans. In 1558, Elizabeth ascended the throne as Queen Elizabeth I. She never married, ruled for 44 years, and oversaw what many consider England's golden age. Commentary. Imagine growing up knowing your mother was executed for crimes she didn't commit. Imagine being told you were illegitimate, unworthy of your throne. And then imagine proving them all wrong. Elizabeth's reign was Anne's revenge. Every time Elizabeth passed through the Tower gates as queen, she walked over the bones of the mother they tried to erase. Today, Anne Boleyn is remembered not as a criminal, but as a trailblazer. She was the first English queen to be executed, but she was also the first queen to wield true influence over policy, religion, and royal power. Her story has inspired countless books, films, and series, not because of how she died, but because of how she lived. Real-life parallel. Think of whistleblowers punished for speaking truth, activists jailed for resisting authority, journalists silenced for uncovering corruption. Anne was the 16th century version of all these figures. She represents the price of speaking out, but also the power of legacy. Conclusion, what we must remember. Anne Boleyn's execution wasn't about justice, it was about control. She threatened the balance of power in a patriarchal world, and for that she paid the ultimate price. But her story did not end on the scaffold. It lived on in her daughter, in history, in every person who's dared to speak truth to power.